Is this on? Are we have audio? Excellent. I'm Jim Pickup. I'm the General Counsel of the Aspen Institute. I also am the president of the Middle East Investment Initiative, which is a not-for-profit organization that we actually founded here and then spun off into its own organization. We work to facilitate credit and investment in small and medium-sized businesses throughout the MENA region. We have a fantastic panel today, and with some diverse experience. I think I'll introduce them first, and then we're just going to go right into questions. And here at the Aspen Institute, the Institute was founded to foster sort of values-based, enlightened dialogue, but it also sort of has a relaxed culture as well. If we were in Aspen, Colorado, none of us would be wearing ties, and we'd be sitting out under the trees somewhere having a wonderful conversation. So, you know, maybe we can kind of put our minds there and have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll definitely open it up to questions from the audience. So in the middle here, we have, and I'm going to, please, I've gotten guidance on pronunciation, but I know I'm going to murder your names here. Sirin Koprucu.
Very good.
Okay, excellent. Is the founder and principal trainer of StrategicStraits, Inc. She is an international business trainer and consultant who specializes in helping clients achieve economic sustainability through the development of a global mindset. Sirin is certified to debrief the Global Mindset Inventory developed by Thunderbird School of Global Management, is a contributor to Developing Your Global Mindset, the handbook for successful global leaders, the first practical handbook published by Thunderbird School in 2013, and designs customized programs to develop specific global mindset skills. Maybe we can talk a little bit more exactly what that is, but it looks fascinating. Sirin also engages extensive first-hand experience in international business based on her work as a marketer and trainer in the pharmaceutical and health companies industries prior to founding StrategicStraits, and consults with larger consulting firms like Aperion Global and Edelman. Sirin holds an MBA degree with specialization in marketing from Eastern Michigan University and an undergraduate degree in business from Istanbul University. She received her training in intercultural communications at the Interchange Institute in Boston, Massachusetts, and at the Intercultural Management Institute of American University here in Washington, D.C. Hope I haven't embarrassed you too much.
Talking so much about me.
Exactly. We'll move on. Exactly. So immediately to my left is Del Renigar, Senior Counsel, Global Government Affairs and Policy at GE. Hopefully I didn't murder your name.
Close enough.
Exactly. Del is the GE Corporate Senior Counsel for Global Government Affairs and Policy. He advises all GE businesses on public policy, trade, investment, national security, market access, and government relations issues in Africa, Middle East, and South Asia, and globally. So leave nothing out there.
Nothing.
Exactly.
It's all in there.
Del also serves as chair of the U.S.-India Business Council's Energy Committee, sits on the board of the U.S.-Algeria Business Council, and is an appointed member of the U.S.-Turkey Business Council. Previously, Del coordinated GE's government affairs and policy issues for the Americas. Before joining GE, Del served as Director of International Economics at for the Western Hemisphere on the National Security Council at the White House on cross-cutting trade, finance, and economic development issues in the Americas and globally. He also served as Senior Counsel to the General Counsel and Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he counseled the Office of the Secretary, the Bureau of Industry and Security, and the International Trade Administration on trade, foreign policy, and national security issues. He was also an associate at a D.C. law firm. And prior to that, was a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School and from Duke University. And finally, Onur Uranli?
Right.
Okay, excellent. 3 for 3. More or less. Onur has a career in increasing responsibility and accomplishment spanning over 20 years. He is the Director of Business Development for the UPS Supply Chain Solutions. Onur is a graduate of ITU Maritime College, Department of DEC. In an early part of his career, he spent 6 years on an ocean-going vessels as a merchant marine deck officer and captain. He holds a Master's of Science degree in International Transportation and Logistics Management from SUNY Maritime College, New York, and started his career with UPS in 2001. He's currently a Director of Business Development, managing the complex supply chains of global major corporations, Till most recently, he was the director of UPS Multinational Sales in America and TMECA, Turkey, Middle East, and Central Asia. So welcome. I guess maybe what we should start first off, and this is a conversation about best practices.
Sure.
And I think we're trying to get a good sense of how Turkish business can do business in the United States and U.S. businesses can do business in Turkey. So clearly Turkey is a very attractive market. As we just heard from Drew, it is a booming market and in a lot of ways has outpaced a lot of its economies in the region. So what could you tell us about the business culture in Turkey that an American business would need to know or would like to know in order to enter that market?
Absolutely, and I first want to thank you very much for inviting me to this very fun panel, and I am thrilled by all the opportunities in both countries through the trades, promising trade even processes that we are going to talk about today. As in many countries, business culture in Turkey is highly influenced by the societal culture, so it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about how we can describe and analyze cultures. And one of the very popular models that we use is Gerd Hofstede's model to do that. And I will mention 5 of his dimensions for time purposes, which are very popularly individualism versus collectivism, meaning how relationship-oriented cultures are versus how much they praise and celebrate the individual achievement and contribution. Large power distance versus small power distance, how much cultures are naturally accept hierarchies and inequalities in societies. And so we should also say that the American culture is more on the individual side, the independent side, and the Turkish culture is much more relationship-oriented and group harmony-oriented. And then in terms of power distance, some hierarchies are much more accepted in the Turkish culture versus the egalitarian culture in the American society. Then we talk about how accepting a society is of ambiguity and risk. And naturally, and every individual is different, by the way, but the United States seems to be more ambiguity accepting than Turkish society. So decisions may come quicker, actually, in this country than in maybe in Turkey. Right. Fourth, I want to talk a little bit about communication, which is described as masculinity versus femininity. But what we are really talking about is the competitive nature of a society and the direct communication style of a society versus more indirect and quality of life oriented style of a society. And Turkey, the US is more on the competitive side, and Turkey is more on the indirect and quality of life oriented side. We have in Turkey a very famous word, keyif. So without taking the time to actually enjoy what you're doing, it's really not worth doing.
We need more of that.
Right, maybe so. Well, now that we've talked about it,
exactly.
Today we'll enjoy that. And the fifth is short-term versus long-term orientation, and that's more about how much of a long-term outlook you have in business and in your decisions versus the short-term outlook. And here in the United States, maybe also supported by the importance of the individual contribution. We really look at quick outcomes when we try to achieve something in the project. What success will come first? So all this sort of considering all this, and your question was American multinationals into Turkey, right?
Although we can talk about the latter, the other way.
The other way very
well.
soon too. Definitely expect to have more hierarchies in Turkish companies, especially if these are family-owned or managed by trusted professional managers, because these people realize that they carry responsibility because of various reasons. So decision making may be much more what we call directive or consultative style than more the consensus building or democratic style. So it's important to understand who the decision makers are and take time to build trust. Then in communication, communication is strongly influenced by context. Communication as well as negotiation. So not only is important what you're saying explicitly in your words, but who is saying it, how you're saying it, where you're saying it, right? And eventually achieving an emotional connection, which is, by the way, and here I want to mention the global mindset model that Thunderbird University came up with through amazing research. An emotional connection is actually an international business skill that you will find if you look into your handouts for a minute under social capital, under the skill of building trust across cultures. Turkish people specifically are, as you can see, once there is trust, expressive communicators. And that's not, specifically actually, that shows honesty. In Turkey we have a saying, içi dışı bir. So if meaning inside is same with outside. If people start realizing that, they realize the sincerity behind what you're saying, and that makes a big difference. Let me see, I can talk about this subject obviously for a very long time, but I did make some notes myself. So in conclusion, as advice, I think for American business people is realizing who has seniority in the counterpart, who has the responsibility, taking time to build relationships, and knowing that things will be moving a little slower than maybe they're used to. And that time is a little bit of more of a commodity than it is here.
Sorry, phone going off there?
No problem.
So Del, GE has a long history in Turkey and has been very successful there. How has GE, given this cultural dynamic, how has GE positioned itself in the country?
Well, thanks. Let me also thank the Aspen Institute for the opportunity to be here and to talk about two of my favorite things, GE and Turkey. Although I'm still having a little difficulty picturing myself in Aspen. Maybe if I had some Coors beer and a bison burger, it might come through. But I'll try to transport myself there.
We can arrange it.
Okay, good. I think our success in Turkey is really based on our being able to identify really where the government is going, what the government's key priorities are, and then looking at that and then trying to figure out how that translates into business opportunities and into business strategy. So as I'm sure you know, Turkey is pursuing a Vision 2023 at the moment that has a number of elements to it. You know, at a very high level, Turkey wants to be, you know, kind of a manufacturing export hub with a strong R&D component. Turkey wants to invest dramatically in its infrastructure in order to, you know, raise the quality of life for its people, as well as to deal with energy efficiency so that they have a little bit more flexibility in the fuel space. And so when we break that down, you know, we see a number of very important opportunities where we can go to the Turkish government and say, look, we're basically your one-stop shop for getting to your Vision 2023, which also, of course, includes becoming the 10th largest economy in the world, which will require a fair bit of growth and breaking down a number of these bottlenecks. And so for us, that means, you know, we look at all the things that GE can do on the energy efficiency side with our technology, our know-how, and our products. On the R&D and manufacturing side, we look at where we have a very strong footprint historically in aviation with a very, very high-tech engineering and repair and research facility there, and how we can expand that and how we can also begin to leverage Turkey more as an export platform and helping us access other markets in the Middle East and in Africa. Again, probably the best example there is we've recently entered into a partnership with essentially the state locomotive or transportation company, and I'm not going to get the name right either, Tolomsish, I believe is the right pronunciation, where we will be entering into a JV with them, which helps us get into the Turkish market, but also provides a great platform for us exporting locomotives to places like Iraq and elsewhere in the region, using the Turkish know-how and the Turkish relationships to help us get in to some of these difficult places. So I'll keep it brief on this run, but essentially the advice is to really figure out what are the key priorities of the government, and then how do you kind of unpack those down to a level of granularity that drives a particular business strategy and leads you to the right business opportunities to ultimately allow you to position yourself really as a trusted advisor, as a trusted partner to the Turkish government.
Absolutely. So Onur, I'm fascinated with your background in logistics and supply chain, because I think one of the key things, certainly as American companies are looking to invest in a place like Turkey, and maybe the sort of casual observer will pick up the newspaper and will see protests and strikes and other things that are obviously very disruptive to supply chains. And so what would be your advice as someone who is an expert in this area, sort of in managing those supply chains and ensuring reliability, particularly when now just-in-time delivery and everything else is so critical to business?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, actually, for this opportunity. I'd like to start with thanking Sarah, Aspen Institute, Neslihan Hanım for Top, and Ozan Bey for actually Tepa for inviting me. After participating the first event, I believe last year, I've enjoyed what I have seen and heard, and had an opportunity to meet with the growth engines of the Turkey economy last year. So I want to just actually be part of it again this year. So it's great to be here. When we just look in the broader scope, what I like to actually emphasize upon is more on the practical side of things. Because I am not an expert in talking about more dollars and cents or the data or statistics, but I'm more like a practical person, because what I do in day-to-day basis is helping the business achieve their goals in making products moving from one part of the world and to another. And by doing that, the logistics and transportation is probably one of the oldest professions of the world. I mean, if you think about it, many
not the oldest, but one of
the oldest. Right, I know. And if you think about like 3,000 years ago, people were still merchants and moving from one part of the world to another to sell their products. When it comes to making international trade and international logistics, there's a lot of actually risks and factors involved with the international transactions. And when I looked at the map, the list of the companies that participating today, I realized actually there are many companies in the different sectors. There is actually mining industry, there is industrial industry, there is food industry, the company participating from food industry, plastics and technology, and all sorts of other industries such as textiles. So ultimately what it means is actually all of those participating members of the companies are actually manufacturing some sort of products and trying to promote those products in the United States, or vice versa. They might have a business in here, promote their business in Turkey. So what's going to be differentiating factor for those companies being successful is making sure their products and services arriving at the dock or warehouse of their customers in time before the expectations. This way they can actually get another order, and it goes on for a while like that. On the paper it looks so easy, so nice. I mean, shipping one pallet of goods and product from one part of the world to another is one of the easiest things you can say. But there could be at least 50, 60 other things can go wrong by not making that particular shipment or product moving the way that we want it. In the events of recent events, it's so timely. That's what I just wanted to bring in, actually. As you might have seen, the unrest, the political or daily unrest in some parts of Turkey, Istanbul, and now it's happening a little bit in Brazil. What does this have to do with a manufacturing company is actually huge. I mean, if you think about it, if I am your customer sitting in Ohio and I'm buying your merchandise, if I actually look your address, see that you're located next to Taksim Square, I mean, this is where all those happening, right? And you are manufacturing somewhere close there, I would be cautious to use you as my vendor, because now you are putting me in risk, because now your merchants, your products could be disruptive if there is something closures in your warehouse, in your manufacturing. So what I suggest to all the members from my daily activities, daily dealings with my clients, major corporations, is they're coming to us and asking, we have an ABC company and we're doing some business with together in Istanbul, but we're not sure if actually they're located in a nice area. Do you know your office can go and visit them to see if there is something that actually they can feed us? Because not everybody can travel all the way, but there are a couple of things I have to just suggest that must be taking place when dealing internationally. There are like two risk factors when doing imports and exports. Physical risks of damages when something happens. Your goods and services could be disruptive, could be actually destroyed. And the other risk factor is actually something not related to terrorism or anything like that, but it's compliance or regulatory compliance. So in dealing with international trade, you have to actually ask, a company should ask themselves a question of, well, are we actually partnering with the right partner, either vendor or the suppliers, to make sure my products can go to my customers in the safest mode? I took a note in here, actually, a quote that I got from one of my customers. When we're discussing to switch their vendors from one part of the world, because of, actually it was Egypt at that time, right? So my customer told me, Onur, I have to just actually have a plan, not B, not C or D. I have to make a plan by like H or G on H. So they have to have another plan in case something is going to go up again in the countries that they're buying. So I like that idea of having multiple plans in case there is actually a disruption in your supply chain. There are a couple of red flags and risk indicators. I'd like to actually bring this up to you, so maybe you can actually take a quick takeaway from my speech in here. If you are finding a vendor, could be a supplier, a manufacturer, or actually a logistics company for that matter. If you are finding the lack of global network of own offices, I'm talking about more like logistics, right? If you are finding a vendor, it's a carrier that does not have their own offices around the world, that might be a risk factor, because now they cannot have a control of, in case you want to move from, one of my customers heavily buying from actually an Egypt, they want to switch it to Vietnam. They were looking for us to just partner with them, and luckily we have our own offices in Vietnam, right? So, and then I also suggested, well, why not Turkey? I mean, Egypt has great textile and cotton, so does Turkey.
No bias or anything.
So we're not biased, right? Yeah, exactly. And then they say, we didn't think of that, but what can you have? And I presented what UPS has in Turkey. I mean, I don't want this to be like a UPS commercial or anything, but I presented what we can do in terms of their supply chain. Instead of going all the way to Vietnam, let's go to Turkey. We have this office in there, we have that office in here. We even have some suppliers I can actually introduce to you. So that approach is actually important. If this customer was dealing, not me, with some other freight forwarder or logistics company that didn't have a direct office in Turkey, that might be a risk factor that I would actually recommend you to be aware of. If the provider is very extremely inexpensive doing business, there must be something that they're cutting corners in terms of compliance. Are they really compliant with what they're supposed to do with all the things that the U.S. government is looking for or Turkish government is looking for? Because these are expensive things. If you're not complying, your cost is down, but ultimately you can put yourself and your customers at risk. And if the company that you're dealing with, supplier or logistics company, is not transparent, you look some transparency. If they cannot do that, that's another risk factor I would actually caution you with. And lack of visibility. I mean, if ultimately you are as good as your goods or services arrived at your customer's destination warehouse, and if you cannot provide your customer the visibility, where your goods, the services, the orders are, that can be actually a risk factor. And I think if you just think everything else, logistics and supply management, supply chain management is a fun thing to do, but you have to have actually right partner with all those parameters in place.
I was going to say I'm all for advertisements because UPS buys a lot of airplanes and they all have a lot of GE engines on them that include a lot of parts designed and manufactured in Turkey. So
it's an interconnected world. Actually, we buy GE engines, and GE turns out uses us for making sure the parts of those engines are actually moving around the world. So it's got like interconnected world.
and a lot of it's centered in Turkey. So it's all good. I think those anecdotes actually are quite powerful because people, I don't think, really understand. Certainly people in Washington down Pennsylvania Avenue there have no idea about the economic dimension of the U.S.-Turkey relationship. I think that's an important message for us to carry. One thing I wanted to pick up on, though, you're talking a lot about risk and some of the volatility, and I think the reality is for companies who are going into Turkey is first of all, I would submit it's not a particularly risky market.
Right.
I just came back from Nigeria where we're doing a lot of work, and I would characterize it as a little different kind of risk. That being said, there is volatility. But the reality is you are not going to get growth rates anywhere in the world above 4% unless you can deal with volatility. And I think the way that you deal with volatility is you really have to have a set of core values, a set of core processes that guide your business strategy. And one of the key features of that is really a long-term approach. And so, whatever is going on in Turkey today, however that comes out, I think ultimately when we see governments being more transparent, when we see governments being more accountable to their people, when we see governments investing more in services and infrastructure, ultimately that leads to huge opportunities for U.S. companies, and ultimately I think it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. Sirin, we talked about the U.S. companies looking at the culture of the Turkish market, but one of the things I think is fascinating about Turkish business now is it's now matured to the extent where you've got very successful Turkish businesses entering the U.S. market, building factories and looking at it as a market itself. What would your advice be to a Turkish business looking to reach out to the United States, and what their view is culturally? How, kind of the flip side of the first question I asked you.
Sure. And so we should look at cultural differences as well as, I think, structural differences in that case.
Sure.
Because there is a big structural difference that I did want to mention today. It's the way the governments are organized in both countries. In Turkey, we have a very central, influential federal government, as we saw in the last few weeks. Not only in the last few weeks, if we look at the incentive programs, for instance, of Turkey, they're all federal incentive programs under Department of Commerce or under an organization called ISPAT. Whereas here you have much more tiered government systems with lower tiers of government, state governments, local governments, and even county-based, that can have their own incentive systems as well as their own laws and regulations. And so this culture is a low context culture, meaning a lot of things are explicitly said, and so it's written, it's very important to follow rules and regulations. And there is a room for litigation, and we will probably get into how to deal with that later on. But in terms of more relationships and culture, you can expect less hierarchies and much faster decision making in American businesses. A junior person may have a lot of authority and responsibility and can lead your business to somewhere. So if you see, if you end up meeting with a junior person, I hear sometimes it can be disappointing to the Turkish counterpart, and it should not be most of the time. Let's see. In terms of communication, we said it's lower context. So the other important thing is that a lot of things are online. So digital becomes extremely important in this country. Social media is extremely important and very well used. So I think that's one other cultural factor that really influences business life. Other than that, I think I will respond to questions as they come.
Sure.
Is that good?
Absolutely. So we were just talking about the real opportunities that a country like Turkey presents. How do you see GE growing its footprint within Turkey over the next several years?
Well, we made a commitment last year that we would look to invest a total of $900 million additional dollars in investment in Turkey over the next several years, and that will be done in a number of key sectors: healthcare, aviation, energy, primarily locomotives, transportation, of course, and R&D. And we are, as much as we can, taking advantage of the incentives programs that Turkey has put out there, and trying to make our way through the policy and regulatory environment in Turkey. But it's probably more challenging than it should be, quite frankly. If you tell a country you want to invest $900 million, you would think it would make things a little easier. But in fact, it still remains a very challenging market. I think on kind of the macro level. I was reading The Economist last night, which is what happens when you're a sleep-deprived father of an 8-month-old. And the Economist basically fingered over-regulated labor market, high minimum wages, a big unproductive informal sector, low female participation in the workforce, and poor education. I would say that's a pretty good accurate statement of what some of the macro challenges are. In particular, just picking up on one, the role of women in Turkey. One of our commitments in our Middle East operations is to dramatically increase the number of women that we have in our workforce, and particularly in leadership roles. But turning back to the more nitty-gritty things, I think Turkey could be an easier environment to do business in. Some of this push for manufacturing involves local content requirements, which are quite high and quite difficult to achieve. I think there are reasonable questions as to whether they would be consistent with the WTO. Turkey has talked about joining the government procurement agreement. Turkey is talking about joining the EU, wants to be part of the US-EU FTA. In order for any of those things to happen, Turkey will have to take a very hard look at some of these localization and local content requirements. And on the incentives programs, I think they're quite good. They do open a number of opportunities to us, but they need to be flexible. When a company comes in and says they want to do something, the answer should be yes, let's figure out how to make it happen, as opposed to no, there's bucket A, B, and C, and you have to wedge yourself into one of those buckets. So I think on the whole, we see a tremendous amount of headroom for us to grow our operations in Turkey. But I think some of these, some of the business climate issues that Drew was flagging in his opening comments are really the headwind that makes it harder.
Right. Well, kind of following off a little bit on what Del was talking about, the free trade agreement. Obviously, being part of the US-EU FTA would be a very interesting, but Turkey in a very interesting position. From your standpoint, from supply chain and logistics and all that, what do you think the real benefits of that would be for all concerned, both Turkey and the US and the EU?
Okay, let me first say what our stance is, and then
Yeah.
I'll explore that. We love FTAs, and UPS loves free trade, and I think I'll leave it at there, and then I'll explain why. Before even there were income tax or sales tax in this country, right? There was always, and there has always been duty taxes. 100 years ago, maybe there was not income tax, but there were still duties and taxes for the revenue generation of United States at that time. As years passed, the global economy evolved in a way that actually countries are not doing business as if the stores doing the business to one another. So it became in a way that free trade is the only trade. I mean, if you just think about it, whatever you just go and turn in a merchandise, it's somewhere made in somewhere in the world. We can understand the protectionism of trying to just protect the local economy and how it's going to affect and all that. But TTIP, Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, so to speak, for EU and US, is going to put actually a lot of emphasis in making the barriers or the borders lifted between the two largest economy in the world, I mean, EU and US. It is the largest FTA if it's signed and if it's going to be in the works. And we love it not because it's going to be actually opening up the free trade and then there's going to be more exports and imports, but also it's going to be affecting the local economies in the both sides. What Turkey actually, how Turkey is going to be affected by that is a little different. Because of Turkey's customs union with EU, Turkey is somehow be part of that or that the whole FTA in one way. U.S. companies will be able to export. I'm just talking like a little bit, maybe like very basic terms, right? So U.S. companies will be able to actually export goods and services to U.S. To Turkey by using Turkey's EU connection with the customs union connection, but Turkey's exporters are not going to be able to use that advantage to their benefit. So what I would actually suggest, if I was not working with UPS, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm looking for some work, some job, some business, I tell this to my friends, do you have a product that is expensive in Turkey right now, that's made in US, that is on demand, but the duties are high in Turkey? Why don't you just position yourself now, make more investigations, search about that? When that TTIP is in effect, when it's in effect, it's not that if, we're hoping like when it's in effect, you will be able to position that product to Turkey maybe 20%, if I'm just hypothetically saying if the duty rate is 20% for that product, right? You will be able to promote that product in Turkey 20% less expensive than today because there's not going to be a duty. So I would, again, speaking of the audience here, what their business is, they have business in Turkey right now. They're expanding in US and other parts of the world. If they have expanded enough to US and maybe they have an establishment in the United States, they might develop another product in the US and then sell that product back to Turkey when TTIP is actually in effect. So that's actually a very easy concept that I have in my mind. I mean, very basically, but that's how I look at it.
Sure.
And as a logistics company and transportation company, of course, we love it because there's going to be more trade internationally and even domestically. So we support it. We're all for it, and hopefully it'll be actually passed through. But again, putting an FTA is one of the most challenging things I believe that administration in the U.S. and both in EU and U.S. have. Not only the TTIP there's a lot of other FTAs that U.S. came into with other nations, such as South Korea. I mean, if anybody has a business in here, why not looking in some other countries that has a FTA? So FTA is good for the economy, for international trade, and for logistics company, of course, we love it, and we support it. And I think I pretty much covered everything I'd like to say about that.
Excellent. Well, why don't we open it up for questions? Do folks here have questions for the panel? Yes. And why don't you say who you're with, or
yeah. So,
and your name?
My name is Mauroni. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm particularly interested in your concern about local content, or how tough that is. Is it the quality? Is it the variety? What makes it difficult for you to meet, or is it just not cost competitive? Expand a little bit on the local content piece that you said is a struggle in terms of doing business with Turkey.
Well, I think across a number of sectors, you're seeing Turkey put in place local content requirements in excess of 50%, which basically means in order to compete, in order to win tenders, you have to be able to demonstrate a very high level of localization. And I think for a multinational company, particularly one that's in multiple sectors, that can be a challenge. First of all, because although we may invest billions of dollars in aviation, that investment isn't going to count when they're keeping score on healthcare products. So it's a little bit of, death by 1,000 cuts to a certain extent. It's also has a little bit of a feel of kind of state planning to it. Perhaps some of the craziest examples from history. There was a rule in Brazil, I think in the 70s or the 80s, that all government computers had to be made in Brazil. You can imagine how well that worked out for Brazil. When you have governments trying to pick sectors or pick winners or losers, it leads to challenges. Now, Turkey is blessed by having a big market and having some strength in some key sectors. But the challenge is when you see that spreading across the entire economy, you really run into problems with economies of scale and with being able to have the right kind of expertise in order to meet those requirements. You also then face the very real situation, well, Turkey's doing it, well, guess who else is doing it? Brazil is doing it, guess who else is doing it? India is doing it, China has indigenous innovation. So it's really this spread around the world of these kinds of policies. And I think the key really is for U.S. companies to be able to make the case of what I call kind of the American value proposition, which is essentially that recipients of FDI from the U.S. should be thinking about American companies for the quality of their products, the kinds of services that they bring to market, the corporate social responsibility that they bring, the quality of the training and the workforce development, all the things that American companies do ought to count when they're trying to keep score of whether you're a good local player or not. And so I think it's an overly narrow focus on what the content is, as opposed to what the total footprint or the total impact of the company is in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Good morning, my name is Sobi, and I manage the global innovation through science and technology. I have a twofold question. One is, what sort of collaboration do you see between Turkey and the other very fast-growing economies like Brazil, India, and China? And second, how do you see the partnership between US and Turkey going to advance the economic relationships in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa?
So Turkey's relationship with the other fast-growing economies of the world, and then Turkey-U.S. relationship as a regional power.
Well, I think I can take the second part of the question. Is the Turkey, the current government's ambition is actually to be the hub for many industries. I mean, they are working to be the financial hub for the region, and I know that they also have an ambition to be the regional transportation hub for Istanbul, and that's why they're actually building its third airport in Istanbul. So Turkey is in that sense competing with, because of the proximity and the region proximity, competing with United Arab Emirates for Dubai, for that, both financial maybe and for transportation logistics hub. And I can give an example. Actually, UPS has built and have just taken ownership of a joint venture that they've been to since 1988. About like three years ago, UPS became the wholly owned subsidiary of that company, and right now we have about like 3,000 employees working for UPS, all owned and operated by UPS companies. Instead of putting the headquarters in Dubai, which it used to be, and UPS decided that actually the headquarters is going to stay in Istanbul, and some work can be done out of Dubai, but we like to create the region on its own, and that's why we have that regions called TMICA, Turkey, Middle East, Central Asia, and all actually operated and managed out of that location. So yes, Turkey is working towards those goals, and I can only speak with intelligently about the matters of transportation and logistics, and for Turkey's relationship for other parts of emerging markets and Brazil and China. I mean, I have some thoughts, but I think it's just not my matter of subjection. So
right.
I'll take a shot at that. I think in terms of the first part of the question, the other, the BRICS essentially. My sense is that it's really a competitive relationship in third country markets at this point. I'm not aware of major collaborations between Turkish and Chinese or Turkish and Indian companies. Instead, my sense is that you see Turkish construction companies, Turkish EPCs, basically in dogfights with the Chinese and the Indians in places like Africa, trying to put projects together. So, as far as I'm aware, it's very much a competitive dynamic in third country markets. I would add, though, for us, we actually see those countries as all being part of really a network of global innovation. We have major research centers in all of those countries that you mentioned, and they work quite collaboratively on a number of different things together. And there are certain skills, certain traits, certain backgrounds that you can pull out of Turkey that complement well some of those kind of backgrounds in China and Brazil and India that kind of create the perfect whole. So I think for a multinational, the question is how you can kind of pull together the best pieces of those different countries. But in terms of the countries themselves, I think it's pretty dire competition. In terms of what the U.S. and Turkey can do together, I think it's really looking at where there's a nice fit between basically U.S. technology and I think Turkish know-how. And there I again would go back to kind of the construction in the EPC space, where you would see U.S. and Turkish companies going after projects together in Africa, as well as other places in the Middle East. The situation with Iraq is a complex one, but I think it's fair to say that Turkish companies would be great partners in Iraq and other places in the Middle East for American companies.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that I agree with all your comments, and there has been, to bring Chinese society and Turkish society more closer to each other, there has been a large cultural trade-off as well. There were events about the Turkish culture in China, and then some large events happened in Turkey just recently to familiarize both societies with each other.
Do you see the gaps as wide between those cultures and as similar to the gaps between, sort of as you were describing, between the U.S. and Turkey, or much wider?
There are definitely gaps, potentially with some aspects as wide as with American culture. So let's say if we talk about the level of directness of communication, right? And I should have maybe mentioned that when we talk about the American culture, it's a very direct communicating culture, and not to be offensive or in any way, but to display honesty and openness. And so Turkish culture is relatively less direct. There's a lot more nonverbal, but then if you go to China, the level of indirect communication and nonverbal communication.
Right. I love the word you used for it. Was it contextual?
Contextual, becomes very contextual.
I've got to remember that. That's great. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Akin Sawyer. I run an investment firm focused in sub-Saharan Africa, but also have a strong interest in other emerging markets. And my question is sort of generalized, but to anyone on the panel, I think in a lot of countries, for example, Nigeria, right, there's a lot of push to develop agriculture, which is a natural advantage, right, but has been underinvested for years. And so there are local content laws in Nigeria, for example, in certain industries, partially to address issues of a lack of investment, issues of relationships in the past that were skewed. So for example, Nigeria is an oil state, and so a lot of investment went into oil. There are lots of challenges there. But my question is, as an American company, or as Americans going to these countries, and it's been touched upon, there's got to be a balanced view in terms of what value you're adding, but then how are you adjusting the American culture to fit the society, right? We've talked about differences in communication and language, and you know, I think part of the challenges of what I've seen is those who are most successful are those who can come in and say, this is the value I add, but this is how it can be adjusted to fit what the country needs. And so it's more of a partnership and more of an equal partnership. And so if you can touch upon those challenges and how you see, especially the gentleman from GE, you know, I know you're doing certain things in Nigeria, you know, how are you engaging in a way that allows you to get a return, get value, develop innovation, but also thinking about knowledge transfer, developing employment opportunities for local youth, investing in industries that allow these countries to really come up and also get a long-term value beyond just the initial business relationship.
So impact and return.
Well, I don't mean to turn this into a discussion about Nigeria, and I think they're different, but I'll try to answer the question. As I said, you know, what we're doing in Turkey is really looking at the Vision 2023 approach and figuring out how we fit into that to make ourselves really a partner to the Turkish government in achieving that vision, which I think is a good vision. In the case of Nigeria, it's really a similar approach. We tend to go in at the top because we can, and so we have what we call a company-to-country agreement, or an MOU, with the government of Nigeria on certain specific sectors where they have identified as priorities and where we have a fit. And so perhaps the one that was most publicized was in the energy space. If you're familiar with Nigeria, Nigeria has 170 million people, so it's significantly larger than Turkey and significantly larger than South Africa. And if you look at the amount of power generation in Nigeria vis-a-vis South Africa, for example, you know, Nigeria has like 3 or 4 gigawatts, and you know, and South Africa has like 50, but yet South Africa's population is 1/3 or less of what Nigeria is. So, i.e., Nigeria needs a heck of a lot of power. But what we've said to the government of Nigeria is, look, we'll help you get to 10 gigawatts of power, but here are all the things that you need to do on the policy side, on the regulatory side, on the business law side, on the incentive side, in order to create an environment where we can actually help you get there. So I think it is certainly going in and knowing who the right players are in the market, figuring out what their interests are, and then partnering with them. At the same time, though, in order to run a global business, you have to have certain common practices, certain common standards, which actually I think ultimately raise the value locally, and that includes, you know, let's be honest, it includes transparency, it includes ethics, it includes process rigor in how you do business. It includes, quite frankly, creating an open reporting environment. One of our biggest challenges is getting people in some of these markets to use the ombudsman process, which is kind of a core of multinational companies, is having mechanisms in place to ferret the issues out and to raise them and to elevate them and to resolve them. Again, that may not be acceptable in Turkish or Nigerian culture, but the reality is in order for us to run a global enterprise, we have to have those kinds of processes, we have to have that kind of transparency, we have to have that kind of frankness.
Well, just quick comment. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Yeah. The key word that I have to actually emphasize is the homework. I mean, not every company is going to be as large as GE when dealing with countries like Nigeria. I mean, they're like small to mid-sized customers, and the resources might not as abundant as GE's. But ultimately, what's going to be actually a differentiating factor between you being successful or not be successful in emerging markets in Africa is actually a new frontier right now, is making sure that you're doing your homework. And I've seen time and time again the clients coming to me about getting into a new market, and they got burned down because they didn't have a right partner, right customer says, and right resources, or all in all, they didn't do their homework well enough. And when you do your homework, you're going to be realizing who's going to be the players that you have to be partnering with, and going to Dell's points. I mean, ethics and compliance, and then your own parameters is going to be has to be in line with what you're going to be doing this business. Not every market is going to be good for every company and their values, but there's a much larger opportunities right now. I'm hearing my customers from Far East to India, and now they're going to Middle East and Africa. And then Ethiopia, I never heard of new customers manufacturing shoes, importing into the United States. It hasn't been like that. It wasn't like that 10 years ago. And in Ethiopia, nice, actually $100 shoes made in Ethiopia. So they did their homework, and they're not successful. It's just the homework, I guess.
Yeah,
Time for.
I'd like to take the opportunity to also elaborate a little bit on the global mindset through your question, because I think it's a very, very important question when we work across markets in any market, not only Turkey or Nigeria. As a company that wants to do a business in a different market, it's very important to be confident of your products, of your ethics, of your values, and yet things will be different there are certain things that will be very different in different countries. So the global mindset gives actually a very compact solution to look at these differences and how to collaborate. It categorizes skills based on intellectual capital, psychological capital, and social capital, and this is all in your handouts. But being able to look through the intellectual capital at markets from cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic differences, and then really be able to understand the needs in that market by making the right analysis. And then in terms of psychological capital, being prepared to work with different mindsets and be comfortable and confident with it. In Turkey, there was a major change in the last few weeks with the alcohol ad ban. So there might have been some companies that had just recently invested in Turkey. So doing business for them will be completely different, with a major business tool being out of the market right now. And then the third one is the ability to build trust across cultures, and what factors really influence that trust building in that specific market. And all this should be able to focus the international business professional to being results oriented by also doing good for the local market they're getting into.
I think we have time for maybe one last question. Here we've got. Well, let's take two questions here, and then we'll finish off with that. So why don't we start here, and then we'll do that, and then we'll answer.
Hi, Larry Sperling. I'm with the State Department's Global Partnership Initiative, and I was intrigued, Del, by your reference to fitting your strategy to Turkey Vision 2023. and the fact that it seems to be a strategy that is designed not just to promote economic growth for the sake of economic growth, but to improve the quality of life and deal with issues such as energy efficiency. Given that this is a panel on best practices, I was wondering if you all could comment on the challenges, opportunities, and importance of investing at least some attention to the broader issues of sustainability as you look at Turkey as a market opportunity, particularly on the social and environmental pillars of sustainable development.
So why don't we take your question as well, and then we can have the panel answer.
Hello, my name is Halit Develioğlu. I am managing Research Tech, supply chain management technology company. I would like to ask you an issue about the issue addressed during your speech. You have mentioned about the low women participation to labor force in Turkey, and I think it is very, very crucial. It is maybe one of the biggest reasons why we have some social, economical, and economical problems in Turkey. And regarding your experiences in other developing countries, I would like to learn what can be the suggestions for the Turkish government to solve that problem in Turkey.
Well, that's a great two questions to sort of wrap up with. So investments in sustainability, and then also best practices to improve women in the workplace.
Okay. Maybe I'll take the first one. Do you want to take the second one?
Fine, yeah.
I can backfill you on the second one if you want. In terms of sustainability, that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think it is clear that Turkey needs to do more with less. And so they have a fiscal account situation. They have an energy security situation, and they're in a fascinating neighborhood, to say the least. So I think what that means for us is we are looking for ways to make them more efficient. And so in the healthcare space, there's a number of things that you can do in healthcare IT. There's a number of things that you can do with healthcare equipment that is cheaper because it's less fancy. A lot of this, there's a Harvard Business Review article on the concept of reverse innovation that Jeff Immelt has written that really looks at our experience in India and figuring out, there are certain core services that you need medical technology to provide, and you should build products around those for some of these markets, as opposed to all the bells and whistles that you put on for your products in Japan or in the US or elsewhere in Europe. So kind of figuring out how to achieve very high results, but with lower cost products in the healthcare space, and looking for these efficiencies either through healthcare IT or through remote diagnosis. A number of things that you can do to lower the overall cost of healthcare, I think, is an important thing for Turkey. On the energy side, we are doing a lot in wind and renewables in Turkey. I think, again, they're looking for ways to get off of the gas and the fossil fuels, not only perhaps because of environmental factors, but I think primarily because of the certainty of supply. Again, I think from a policy perspective, the U.S. could probably do a lot with LNG exports to Turkey. That may help. It would also help us sell more gas turbines, by the way. Mm-hmm. But I think there are a number of things on energy management, whether it's distributed power so that you don't have to have just huge power plants, but you can have smaller units that have more flexibility to come on and offline and to service some of these remote areas. Turkey has a long expressed interest in nuclear. Again, this is one of these things where if they actually looked at the best practices globally of how to actually get a nuclear program up and running, it would be a lot easier for companies to build nuclear plants in Turkey. So I think we are doing a lot of things really ultimately focused on efficiency and cost savings while maintaining very high quality is really our approach on that.
And I'll address the second question. I am a strong believer of international businesses growing with social responsibility for the countries they're moving into. I mean, first of all, the country is welcoming them. They're hosting. That's the host country, right? The home country versus the host country. In addition to being corporate social responsibility having a large effect on marketing and revenues and loyalty, that will eventually also have an impact on risk management. Now, with regards to the role of women in Turkey, I think there's large space for us all to support that role. The participation is about 20%, I'm going to say. 28% now? Yes, you're right. That has increased in the last few years. And a lot of women are much more active about protecting their rights and furthering younger women and furthering the women's profession. And yet I think there's also room to support laws that will support the women. Some laws, I think, look more like they are supportive of women by giving them, for instance, larger maternity leaves and all, but then how attractive does it make this for the business to hire a woman? If there's a lot of cost associated with hiring women, how effective? So I think there's a lot of room for supporting the quality of life of women, but as well as the value of hiring women into the business. And I see a role for international businesses entering the market.
I would say in our experience, I think role models are important and having an effective mentoring program. And you got to put yourself out there. So actually our country CEO, the head of our operations in Turkey is a woman. And it's kind of like there's American culture, the field of dreams. If you build the baseball stadium, they'll come. If you put women in high profile roles, I think it attracts more women, and indeed now the head of our government relations in Turkey is also a woman. I think it's also putting in place, to the extent you can, in addition to kind of the mentoring thing, is networking opportunities. I think in different cultures, women don't necessarily network the same way that men do, and I think that is perhaps a systemic disadvantage to them in building business opportunities. So looking for ways to structure the right kind of professional networking for women, in addition to kind of the mentoring and the leadership is I think what you need to do.
And networking is, I think, what I found this country to be an expert in networking. I've also seen this when I worked for a Swiss company called Roche in Switzerland. And so whoever gets transferred to the global headquarters of Roche in Basel starts feeling a little lonely, because Basel is kind of a quiet city. Many people perceive it that way, although it has so many travel opportunities. So here I am for about a year working my heart out, and suddenly we are become aware of these one American woman and one Canadian woman who decide to form this International Business Women's Forum. And suddenly we have all these networking events going on with great food and great conversations, and we're all connected and very supportive of each other. I think that's a very good point, but I also see, American companies could assume leadership in that, and not that I don't see that not happening. For instance, the pharmaceutical industry has quite a few American members and many female executives mentoring there. But yes, I think you should ask this question in as many forums as you can, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I think this has been a great panel, and I'm sure there'll be lots more throughout the day. Anna, are there any other announcements going into the next group, or?
We're going to have a short coffee break so everyone can get refueled, and then we'll start back up in a couple minutes. If you want to just hang around right out here.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.